Hello, and welcome to PubK's 2023 Government Contracts Annual Review. We're thrilled to have almost 5,000 registrants for this entire program. This is the final session of our 2023 Annual Review. Hard to believe. I hope you found the sessions that you participated in informative. I'm confident you'll find this session informative as well. My name is Alan Schwatkin. I'm the president of the PubK Group and a partner in the law firm Nichols Lew. I'll be your host, facilitator, and moderator. The PubK Group publishes 4 newsletters: PubK Law, PubK Compliance, PubK Cyber, and our newest, launched in mid-2022, PubK M&A. Many of you are already subscribers to one or more of these publications, and we very much appreciate your support. Some of you joining this annual review are not yet subscribers, but I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. Information is at the website shown on the slide, or is available from any of the contacts you have at the PubK Group. This conference would not have been possible without the strong support of our event sponsors, all of whom are listed on these next 2 slides. I encourage you to look at the skills and capabilities of these firms and engage them accordingly. Also new in 2022, PubK joined with Arnold and Porter to launch a periodic podcast called Bonafide Needs, covering emerging issues and interesting interviews. We'll continue that in 2023 as well. I hope you'll consider following those through our website. And if you're interested in partnering with PubK on a podcast, we'd be pleased to discuss this opportunity with you. In lieu of speaker gifts and in honor of our sponsors, PubK is making a contribution to the Capital Area Food Bank. I hope you'll also consider making either an individual or an organizational contribution. Since the entire program is being held virtually, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. Your video will remain disabled throughout the session. But we do welcome your questions. Use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. However, with so many attendees, it will not be possible to answer all of the questions in real time. We are capturing your questions and will endeavor to answer as many as possible after the conclusion of the annual review. The presentation slides for this segment are now available for download on the PubK site. All presentation slides, along with the audios, will be available for download from the PubK site, probably within a week or so of the conclusion. We'll send an email when this information is available for download, how to access it, and for how long the material will be available. We are also applying for continuing legal education approval in Virginia, California, Texas, Florida, Colorado, and Kansas. We've already received Texas and Florida approval. And while we cannot guarantee approval in the other jurisdictions, we expect that acceptance within the next few weeks. Again, if you've notified us that you're interested in getting CLE, we'll notify all attendees when those approvals have been received. But if you're interested in obtaining CLE, please look for our poll questions during the presentation. There'll be 2 of them, 1 each hour. The state boards require us to verify your participation during the event. We'll keep track of responses to verify that you viewed the panel. If you don't wish to obtain CLE credit, you can just disregard the poll or answer for fun. Now, I'm thrilled to conclude this 8th PubK annual review with our session 12 panel on statutes, regulations, executive orders, and policies. Our distinguished panel members are Mike Scheingold from Greenberg Traurig and Cara Sakamoto from Wiley. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. By the way, everyone, you'll probably want to disable my audio when I'm done with this presentation or halfway through it. But I did want to tell you that I have not been asked to say anything about PubK Group's various products, so I won't. More seriously, while I haven't been asked or even encouraged to say anything, I wanted to observe that PubK Group's publications are outstanding and invaluable to my practice. Now, unfortunately, at least for those watching this presentation, we have a lot to cover, including 10 acts of Congress passed in 2022 related to federal procurement law. A list should be up on your screen of some of them, and you'll be able to scroll through and see all of them in chronological order. I have prepared detailed materials that are on the PubK Group's website, and you will probably find it easier to follow my presentation by looking at those materials, because 4 of the acts that I'm going to go over, one of which was 4,408 pages, were passed in December, and I just didn't have time to do fancy slides, but we did cover all of them in detail in the materials. So I'm going to start now with March 15th, 2022. That's when President Biden signed into law the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it because it's been discussed by a previous panel, and more importantly, Carl will discuss some pre-regulatory activity. I think the takeaway is that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency will at some point be issuing regs that'll explain how covered entities must report certain cyber incidents within 72 hours of their occurrence, and ransom payments within 24 hours of the payments. The regs are due to be issued in final by March 2024. Next, on August 9th, 2022, the president signed into law the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors Act of 2022, that is the CHIPS Act, which was passed as part of a broader bill targeting scientific initiatives, that is the Research and Development, Competition and Innovation Act, aka the CHIPS and Science Act. We're focused here on the CHIPS Act, which appropriates substantial money to several funds for American and allied country semiconductor R&D, manufacturing, and workforce development. The law is intended to bolster U.S. leadership in semiconductors and ensure a secure domestic or allied country supply chain. While the CHIPS Act creates various opportunities for government contractors, it does not have a major impact itself on procurement law. The CHIPS Act authorizes over $52 billion for 4 funds. The vast majority of this money will be under the control of the U.S. Department of Commerce via the Chips for America Fund, which includes funding for semiconductor technology R&D, increasing domestic production and manufacturing of advanced semiconductors, and incentivizing private entities to invest in domestic semiconductor manufacturing. A second fund, the Chips for America Defense Fund, makes available $2 billion to DoD to establish a public-private partnership to incentivize the formation of one or more consortia of companies to ensure the development and production of secure microelectronics. The CHIPS Act also provides for the creation of up to 3 new Manufacturing USA institutes dedicated to the domestic R&D and manufacture of course, semiconductors. These institutes are also public-private partnerships. Now, the CHIPS Act makes the majority of its funds available to the Commerce Department to fund initiatives that are accessible to federal contractors, subcontractors, grantees, subgrantees for R&D, production, and manufacturing of semiconductor technologies. The CHIPS Act adds a new provision which authorizes the Secretary of Commerce, in carrying out her CHIPS Act responsibilities, to enter into agreements, including contracts, grants, and cooperative agreements, and other transactions as may be necessary and on such terms as she considers appropriate. Next, on August 16th, 2022, President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which provides for billions of dollars in funding and financial incentives to address, among other issues, climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The act follows various other Biden administration efforts to advance green procurement. While there are relatively few provisions related to federal procurement law in this act, it includes significant provisions related to federal spending, particularly for environmentally friendly green projects. For example, Section 7002 provides $3 billion in funding for the Postal Service to purchase, among other items, zero-emission delivery vehicles. While I won't further discuss the significant federal spending provisions, they are identified in my materials and also include extensive tax credits and funding for grants, cooperative agreements, direct loans, and loan guarantees. Next, we'll turn to September 30th, 2022, the end of the fiscal year. On that date, President Biden signed into law the Sbir and Sttr Extension Act of 2020, which reauthorizes the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer programs for 3 years and makes certain other important adjustments. Now, the possibility existed that the Sbir and Sttr programs would not be renewed in 2022 because of congressional concern over several matters, including the security of the research performed and Sbir mills. Senator Paul stated that, quote, according to SBA's public data, 196 businesses received more than 100 Sbir awards each. Some businesses received more than 900 awards. Sounds like somebody has figured out the system here, end quote. As a result, various changes were made to substantially increase the scrutiny of these programs, including through GAO and agency studies. Now, under this act, each agency required to have an Sbir or Sttr program shall establish and implement a due diligence program to assess security risks presented by small businesses. These due diligence programs must assess, quote, the cybersecurity practices, patent analysis, employee analysis, and in particular, foreign ownership of a small business seeking an award, including the financial ties and obligations of the small business and its employees to a foreign country, foreign person, or foreign entity, end quote. This act is designed to combat, quote, malign foreign influence. So each agency with one of these programs shall require small businesses submitting proposals to disclose very substantial information about foreign affiliation, especially with China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran, or any other country determined to be of concern by the Secretary of State. Significantly, a small business receiving an award under these programs is required to repay all amounts received if, one, the small business makes a material misstatement that the agency determines poses a risk to national security, or two, there is a change in the small business's ownership, change to its entity structure, or other change that poses a national security risk. Now, the Act also substantially increases the performance standards for companies with multiple awards. As a result, a small business that has received more than 50 Phase 1 awards, and there are 3 phases of awards, but a small business that has received more than 50 Phase 1 awards over the past 5 years must meet a Phase 1 to Phase 2 transition rate that is double the current rate. That is, the small business must have an average of at least 2 Phase 2 awards for every 4 Phase 1 awards received. A small business that has received 50 or more Phase 2 awards over the past 10 years must reach a commercialization benchmark of an average of $250,000 of sales or investments per Phase 2 award received. A small business that has received more than 100 Phase 2 awards, in other words, they've hit the jackpot with receiving Sbir awards, must have an average of $450,000 in sales and/or investments per Phase 2 award received. So what if they don't? If a small business does not meet these increased thresholds, then the small business is limited to 20 new Phase 1 or direct to Phase 2 awards at the participating agency in the following year. Okay, next, we move on to October 10th of last year. On that date, President Biden signed into law the One-Stop Shop for Small Business Compliance Act of 2021. Again, of 2021, although it was signed in 2022. Now, an existing act, the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act of 1996, requires federal agencies to publish a small entity compliance guide for significant agency rules. The guide must be posted, including on the cognizant agency website, no later than the rule's effective date. The One-Stop Act requires that no later than April of this year, the SBA establish and maintain a centralized one-stop website that includes hyperlinks to the small business compliance guides of each federal agency. SBA's website must also include contact information for each of those agencies' employees who can offer small businesses assistance with each compliance guide. Now, as a little bit of an aside, while I recognize that SBA has many very important duties and limited resources, it seems rather unfortunate that an act of Congress was required to mandate what appears to be the somewhat obvious action of establishing hyperlinks on SBA's website to other agencies' compliance guides. So, moving on October 17, 2022, President Biden signed into law the End Human Trafficking in Government Contracts Act of 2022. Although the U.S. government has a, quote, zero tolerance policy for human trafficking by federal employees and contractors, very sadly, as recently as August 2021, GAO found that foreign workers employed under federal contracts, particularly related to overseas U.S. military base support contracts, continue to be trafficked on a persistent basis. This is really a total disgrace. So prior to this act's enactment, if a federal agency received one, an IG report substantiating an allegation that a contract grantor, cooperative agreement recipient, or any subgrantee, subcontractor, or agent thereof, engaged in a human trafficking crime, or two, the agency received notification of an indictment, criminal complaint for trafficking related to such a contractor, subgrantee, or subgrantee. Believe it or not, at that time, before the passage of this act, the agency only needed to consider initiating a referral to the agency suspension and debarment officials. This act now requires a federal agency to refer such matters to the agency suspension debarment official. However, the act does not mandate suspension or debarment. So moving along, next, the Quantum Computing Cybersecurity Preparedness Act was signed by the President on December 21st, 2022, right before the holidays, and requires federal agencies to identify agency information technology that is susceptible to decryption by quantum computers and prioritize that IT for migration to post-quantum cryptography. So what is post-quantum cryptography? The statute defines it as cryptographic algorithms or methods that are assessed not to be specifically vulnerable to attack by either a quantum or classical computer. The act included a sense of Congress, which is that most encryption relies on the computational limits of classical computers, what we use now, to develop the encryption protocols. But that development in quantum computing, but that developments in quantum computing suggest that these limits may soon be surpassed, leaving present encryption protocols vulnerable. As a result, the sense of Congress in the Act concludes that a strategy for the migration of information technology of the federal government to post-quantum cryptography is needed. A result of this statute for federal contractors and subcontractors is that post-quantum cryptography is coming very soon to the federal government, with the expectation that IT provided to the government will be able to navigate both classical encryption and post-quantum cryptography, or at least be capable of adjustment to accommodate post-quantum cryptography. So this strikes me as an area where there's going to be a lot of new work. Now, not later than June of this year, OMB is required to issue guidance on the migration of IT to post-quantum cryptography. Okay, I'm hoping I haven't lost the Zoom connection. Next, I see I haven't. Sorry, I thought I had. Next, on December 23rd, 2022, right before the holidays, and nearly 3 months after the start of the government's 2023 fiscal year, the James M. Inhofe National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, for FY 2023 was signed into law by the President, becoming the 62nd consecutive fiscal year that a NDAA has been enacted. Unfortunately, signing the NDAA in December, long after the start of the fiscal year, is not unusual, with 5 of the last 7 NDAAs becoming law in December and 1 actually becoming law in January. The NDAA is primarily a policy bill and does not provide budget authority for DoD, but it does authorize the appropriation of budget authority. The amounts authorized by the NDAA are not binding on the appropriations process, but typically serve as a reliable indicator of congressional sentiment. The 2023 NDAA authorized defense spending of about $45 billion higher than the President requested, which is in fact the amount appropriated by the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2023, which of course the President signed into law during the holiday season on December 29, 2022. I only point this out because we had to scramble over the holidays to figure all this stuff out. Now, the 2023 NDAA's procurement-related changes are primarily located, as usual, in the Act's Title VIII, Acquisition Policy, Acquisition Management, and related matters. And it includes 55 provisions addressing procurement matters. This is modestly less than in each of the past 4 NDAAs. Now, certain provisions in other titles of the 2023 NDAA are very important to procurement law, and hopefully I'll get to a couple. Some of the 2023 NDAA's provisions will not become effective until the FAR or DFARs, possibly other regulations like SBAs, are amended or new provisions are promulgated, which sometimes can take 2 to 4 years or more. As to major themes, the 2023 NDAA broadly focuses on China, the defense industrial base and supply chain, cybersecurity and software, and efforts to streamline the acquisition process, including commercial buying. These themes can be seen in various procurement-related provisions and are a continuation largely from last year's NDAA. These themes were driven in part by, believe it or not, the bipartisan and also bicameral focus on China, and include prohibiting certain purchases from China and also Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Within the industrial base, this year's NDAA includes a subtle shift from a Buy American to a more Buy American / Buy Allies policy. I'll look to the joint explanatory statement, which accompanies the NDAA as legislative history, to help explain the 2023 NDAA. I'll now turn to certain of its provisions. We will start with Section 801. It is worth looking at the title of that. The title is Writing Award to Encourage Curiosity and Persistence in Overcoming Obstacles in Acquisition. Sounds like the title for a self-help book. In any event, Section 801 provides that the president of the Defense Acquisition University shall establish 2 programs to provide awards to recognize DoD acquisition workforce members. First, not more than 5 awards per year of up to $5,000 each to such members who use an iterative writing process, whatever that is, to document a firsthand account of using independent judgment to overcome an obstacle faced in the defense acquisition system. And second, 1 award per year of not more than $5,000 to such members who make the best use of the flexibilities and authorities granted by the FAR and the defense acquisition system. Now, obviously, these awards are not that important to procurement law. However, this section is relevant because it's another congressional effort to encourage innovative acquisition thinking, independent judgment, persistence, and even curiosity, presumably as a counter to certain negative bureaucratic tendencies. So, turning next to Section 803, it grants DoD authority to obtain more data to support commercial products determinations for certain aspects of major weapon systems, that is, for subsystems, components, or spare parts thereof. There are a lot of complicated details related to this section, including for procurements where certified cost or pricing data is required because there was not adequate price competition. But I can't get into them, frankly, because of time constraints and my inability to articulate these very complicated principles. But what I do think you should take away from this, and it's covered in the materials, is that some language in the Joint Explanatory Statement, the JES, which is the legislative history for the NDAA, is worth identifying. The JES observes that the 2020 NDAA Senate report required the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment to submit an annual report detailing instances where potential contractors had denied contracting officer requests for uncertified cost or pricing data to allow for the determination of fair and reasonable pricing. The JES has, and I'm quoting now, found these data denial reports to be illuminating and directs the Undersecretary to continue submitting this annual report to the Congressional Defense Committees and to make appropriate portions of these reports available to the leadership of companies named in the reports so they, 1, are aware they are named, 2, have an opportunity to provide amplifying information related to the reported instances, and 3, take timely corrective action to address internal compliance procedures. Now, that is interesting because some of the time a company wouldn't have an obligation to provide the data to the government, but the government is nevertheless pushing you to do it. So we turn to Section 804. It resolves inconsistencies between the rapid acquisition authorities from the 2003 and 2011 NDAAs. The procedures for urgent acquisition and deployment of capabilities needed in response to urgent operational needs may be used for capabilities that, 1, can be fielded within 2 to 24 months, 2, do not require substantial development effort, 3 are based on proven and available technologies, and 4 can be acquired under fixed price contracts. These procedures also can be used for capabilities that can be developed or procured under the rapid fielding acquisition pathway or the rapid prototyping acquisition pathway authorized by the 2016 NDAA. Notably, in certain sections, Section 804 has a goal of awarding a contract within 15 days and provides the authority for the waiver of certain laws or regulations that would unnecessarily impede the urgent acquisition and deployment of such capability. So we turn now to Section 805. It amends 10 U.S.C. 3862 to clarify that unilateral insertion of a clause implementing an executive order into an existing DoD contract or other transaction agreement, OTA, by a contracting officer is considered a directed change subject to the changes clause in the contract or OTA. Thus, this section confirms that contractors are entitled to submit a request for equitable adjustment for the cost and or schedule impact of compliance when new clauses implementing executive orders are unilaterally incorporated into existing DoD contracts. Now, Section 805 imprecisely defines the changes clause to mean, quote, the clause described in FAR Part 52.243-4. This may cause some confusion because, among other reasons, while OTAs may, but often do not include some form of changes clause, the FAR does not apply to such agreements, and OTAs don't ordinarily include FAR 52.243-4. Now, Section 805 requires DoD to revise the DFARS and applicable OTA policy to implement this requirement by April of this year. We'll turn next to Section 807. It clarifies that the whistleblower protections for contractors and subcontractor employees under 10 U.S.C. 4701 for DoD and 41 U.S.C. 4712 for civilian agencies or civilian contracts also apply to grantees, subgrantees, and personal services contractors. So it cleaned up some statutory ambiguity, and it also amends both statutes to permit agencies to consider disciplinary or corrective action against government officials as a remedy for an unlawful reprisal. Turning to Section 811, it amends 10 U.S.C. 239 Cb, which requires the Secretary of Defense to include in DoD's budget justification materials a proposal for certain multi-year DoD contracts for which an agency intends to cancel or reduce the quantity to be procured. Section 811 specifically requires that any such proposal include, quote, a detailed explanation of the rationale for the proposed cancellation or reduction of the multi-year contract. We'll turn to Section 816. As background, 2022 NDAA Section 1684, entitled Determination on Certain Activities with Unusually Hazardous Risks. That Section 1684 required DoD to report to Congress on contractor indemnification requests for contracts with unduly hazardous risks received by DoD for fiscal years 2022 and 23, and to provide a detailed study of various indemnifications and insurance issues. Section 816 extends, one, this requirement to include fiscal year 2024, and two, the DoD report due date on certain indemnification issues to as late as December 2024. Much more importantly, the joint explanatory statement observes that, quote, "We remain concerned with the lack of resolution regarding open DoD indemnification requests. We note these delays could lead to significant delivery delays for both hypersonic weapon programs and other critical programs. We are also concerned with inconsistencies across the military services regarding implementation of 10 USC 3861, involving indemnification for R&D contracts, and Executive Order 10789, providing authority for Public Law 85-804 extraordinary contractual relief. Further, we note that the report provided to the Congressional Defense Committees by the Undersecretary did not fully respond to the requirements of the 2022 NDAA Section 1684. As a result, the JES directs the Secretary to provide a fully responsive report not later than February 2023. Notably, the JES to the 2022 NDAA Section 1684 requires GAO to research and submit a comprehensive report on DoD's indemnification of unusually hazardous risks, including all aspects of the insurance market, for example, whether there is even insurance available. This report is due February 1 of this year, could be of significant interest to those defense and other contractors impacted by unduly hazardous risks, plus various agencies, including DoD, NASA, DHS, DOE, and also insurance companies and investors. We'll now move on to Section 817. It expands the prohibition on operating or procuring unmanned aircraft systems to now include Russia, Iran, and North Korea, in addition to China and certain other actors. This prohibition, however, does not become effective until October 1, 2024. That seems like a long window. Turning to Section 822. Public Law 85-804 empowers the President to authorize agencies exercising national defense functions to freely enter into, amend, and modify contracts without regard to certain provisions of law related to contracts whenever the President considers that such action would facilitate the national defense. The FAR refers to Public Law 85-804 as extraordinary authority that may involve an amendment without consideration that increases the contract price. Now, Section 822 is limited to DoD contracts. More specifically, this section provides that the Secretary of Defense, acting pursuant to presidential authorization, 1, may make an amendment or mod to a DoD contract when, due solely to economic inflation, the cost to a prime contractor performing a contract is greater than the price of the contract, and 2, DoD may not request consideration from the prime for the amendment or modification. The same or parallel situation exists for a subcontractor based solely on economic inflation. In addition, if for some reason a prime does not or will not make such a request on behalf of the subcontractor may directly submit to a DoD contracting officer the inflation adjustment request. Now, any adjustment or modification made to a contract or subcontract shall, 1, be contingent upon continued contract performance, and 2, account only for the actual cost of performing the contract or subcontract, which may include indirect costs of performance as the Secretary of Defense determines appropriate. Significantly, only amounts specifically provided by an Appropriations Act can be used to fund these economic inflation adjustments. Not later than 90 days after the enactment of such an Appropriations Act, DoD is required to issue implementing guidance. This inflation adjustment authority is effective from, well, December 23rd, 2022 through the last day of 2023. On this subject, the joint explanatory statement says, we recognize that higher than anticipated economic inflation continues to challenge the budgeting and execution processes of DoD and the defense industrial base. Their ability to adapt to economic conditions is a critical factor in maintaining the health of the defense industrial base, especially when economic conditions are unusually volatile and in regard to firm fixed price contracts where industry bears the predominant financial risk. We believe DoD should be provided tailored authority to engage extraordinary measures to address extraordinary economic impacts. Now we'll move on to Section 842. It clarifies that non-competitive follow-on production contracts for prototype projects may be awarded even if the RFP did not explicitly state that they could be awarded, provided that 1, competitive procedures were used for the selection of parties for participation in the prototype project, and 2, participants successfully completed the prototype project. Moving to Section 843, it amends 10 U.S.C. 4022 to expand DoD's OTA authority by substituting carry out prototype projects that are directly relevant to enhancing the mission effectiveness of personnel of the DoD and improving platforms for the more limiting carry out prototype projects that are directly relevant to enhancing the mission effectiveness of military personnel and the supporting platforms. As a result of this substitution, these OTAs can now be used to enhance the mission effectiveness of all DoD personnel with respect to prototype projects, which the statute defines broadly. The JES on this subject strongly encourages DoD to invest in continuous and experiential education for management, technical, and contracting personnel, as well as attorneys, to understand how to effectively and innovatively use other transactions. We'll move on to Section 851. It adds New Zealand to the National Technology and Industrial Base, which also includes the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. Next, Section 852 amends 10 U.S.C. 4864, which limits certain procurements, for example, for components for naval vessels and auxiliary ships, some satellite components, and for some reason buses, to domestic or national technology and industrial based sources. Section 852 requires DoD to periodically review these limitations and submit to the Congressional Defense Committees a determination of whether such limitations should be continued, modified, or terminated. Next, Section 856 makes permanent the Defense Mentor Protege Program, which was originally authorized as a pilot program in 1991. The amendments to the DoD Mentor Protege Program by Section 856 do not apply to agreements that predate the 2023 NDAA's enactment. Section 856(1) reduces the value of DoD contractors that a mentor firm must have during the fiscal year preceding the fiscal year in which the mentor firm enters into a mentor protege agreement from $100 million to $25 million. And it reinstates the 3-year program participation term that was previously in place. It also sets up a 5-year pilot program to allow the mentor to receive up to 25% of the reimbursement for which a mentor firm is eligible under the mentor protege program. I'm sorry, a 5-year pilot program under which a protege firm may receive up to 25% of the reimbursement for which the mentor firm is eligible. Moving along, Section 858 requires the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment to review items identified in this section and develop appropriate actions to ensure secure domestic production and acquisition of the items. A sampling of the items includes solar components for satellites, satellite ground station services, naval vessel shafts, infrastructure or equipment for a passenger boarding bridge at military airports, U.S. flags, natural rubber, carbon fiber, and proteins. Now, DoD is required to undertake an analysis for each item and develop recommendations. DoD is required to submit to the Defense Congressional Committees a summary of the findings and recommendations, which may include restricting procurement to U.S. suppliers, suppliers in the NTIB, suppliers in other allied nations, or other suppliers, or prohibiting procurement from selected sources. Next, 860, Section 860 implements pharmaceutical and drug reporting requirements for the Undersecretary and the Defense Health Agency Director. For example, by December of this year, the Undersecretary is required to 1, develop and issue implementing guidance for risk management of DoD pharmaceutical supply chains. 2, identify supply chain information gaps regarding DoD's reliance on foreign supplier of drugs. And 3, submit a report to the Congressional Armed Services Committees about DoD's reliance on high-risk foreign suppliers of drugs. We turn to Section 871. Under that section, codifies the annual scorecard program for evaluating federal agency compliance with small business contracting goals, which is available on SBA's website. Section 871 also requires certain additional information to be included on federal agency and government-wide scorecards with respect to the percentage and total dollar amount of awards made to women-owned small businesses, hub-zone businesses, service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, and 8A small businesses through sole source contracts and competitions restricted to those small businesses. Now, moving on, Section 883 provides that the value of modifications to or orders under a contract by DoD on or after March 1, 2020 to address the COVID-19 pandemic through vaccines and other therapeutic measures will not count towards any limit established prior to March 1, 2020 on the total estimated amount of all projects to be issued under the contract. The value of any such modification or order will still count towards meeting any guaranteed minimum value. I think this section was perceived as helping contractors, but it is possible contractors might not want the maximum amount lifted. Next, Section 884. It involves controlled unclassified information. And more specifically, the JES notes in an understatement that DoD's uneven application of controlled unclassified information markings is particularly problematic for industry. Congress is concerned that ineffective training and oversight has led to overclassification of entire documents and a lack of clear portions marking within documents. So this section basically says to DoD, clean up this mess and properly train your people so that we do not overly classify materials, particularly CUI materials. Now, leaving Title 8, Section 1244 is important. It gives DoD specific authorities that can be used for contracts, subcontracts, transactions, or modifications to provide support to Ukraine, support to allies helping Ukraine, or to replenish stocks that are drawn down to support Ukraine. According to the joint explanatory statement, DoD, quote, would benefit from temporary acquisition flexibilities to increase its stock of critical munitions, provide material and related services to allies and partners that have supported Ukraine, and provide them to Ukraine. Those authorities include using the Special Emergency Procurement Authority in 41 U.S.C. 1903, waiving certain restrictions on undefinitized contractual actions, and exempting certain certified cost and pricing data requirements. These authorities terminate September 30th, 2024. Section 1244 also provides multi-year procurement authority for specified munitions as additions to existing DoD contracts. As noted by the JES, providing multi-year procurement authority for certain munitions programs is essential to increase DoD's stock of such munitions, improve war-fighting readiness, provide the industrial base with predictable production opportunities and firm contractual commitments, and increase and expand the defense industrial capacity. So you'll be relieved to know I'm almost done punishing you. Next, Section 5949 prohibits all federal agencies, not just DoD, from acquiring or contracting for electronic parts, products, or services that include covered semiconductor products or services. Covered semiconductors are from 3 companies that are related to the government of China and also other entities as determined by the Secretaries of Defense or Commerce. There is some ambiguity in this statute, so the implementing regulations will be important. Now, significantly, this provision doesn't take effect for 5 years, not until December 2027. Permits waivers and grandfathers in systems using covered semiconductors on the day before the prohibition goes into effect in December 2027. The FAR is required to be revised within 3 years and must include certain flow-down requirements and a certification of non-use by contractors. You know, there's some safe harbor provisions and other points that are interesting, but it's so far off that it's probably not worth discussing yet. Next, Section 1553 requires DoD to implement a plan for testing, including penetration testing and evaluating the cybersecurity of the clouds of commercial cloud service companies providing DoD storage or computing of classified data. The plan is required to include that new contracts with cloud providers grant DoD the right to conduct independent threat realistic assessments. The plan is required to be implemented by June of this year. Last section of the NDAA is 5921, at least that we're going to talk about. It codifies the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, FedRAMP, that is run by GSA. According to the joint explanatory statement, FedRAMP, quote, provides a standardized, reusable approach to security assessment and authorization for cloud computing products and services that process unclassified information used by agencies. Codification of the program makes mandatory many of the goals of the FedRAMP program. Unfortunately, a 2019 GAO report found that many agencies were not using it, and hence the codification. The section also includes some changes that are summarized in my materials. That ends the NDAA, but you're not done yet. One more section. My apologies. Next, on December 27th, 2022, smack in the middle of the holiday season, President Biden signed into law the Preventing Organizational Conflicts of Interest in Federal Acquisition Act, which responds, in part, to high-profile alleged management consulting conflicts of interest in performing services of the U.S. government. The Act requires the FAR to be revised by June 2024, so that provides a lot of time, to provide and update definitions related to specific types of organizational conflicts of interest, or OCIs, including unequal access to information, impaired objectivity, and bias ground rules. These are the three types of OCIs identified in federal procurement case law, but not specifically defined in the FAR. The Act further requires revisions of the FAR to provide illustrative examples of situations related to the potential OCIs, including, and I quote, an example of the awarding by a federal regulatory agency of a contract for consulting services to a contractor if employees of the contractor performing work under that contract are permitted by the contractor to simultaneously perform work for a private sector client under the regulatory purview of that agency. That may sound familiar because that sounds an awful lot like the facts of the alleged management consulting OCI that led to this legislation. Now, the Act also requires the FAR to be revised to provide agencies with solicitation provisions and contract clauses to avoid or mitigate OCIs. That's because the current FAR Part 52 doesn't include any OCI solicitation clauses. My final thought on this for you is that the proposed FAR changes, and we don't know what they will likely be significant to implement these statutory requirements, and will almost certainly be subject to the FAR version of notice and comment public rulemaking. Contractors should seriously consider submitting comments during the rule-making process. So that, you will be delighted to know, is the end of my punishment for you. I think Craig has to make a brief statement before Cara will explain to you what I said and what I meant to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to run our quick poll here for CLE attendance. Please answer if you would like to receive CLE. The poll will be up for 2 minutes, but I'm going to turn it over to Cara, who can begin her presentation now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Mike. As a reminder, I'm Cara Socolato from Wiley-Rein, and I'm pleased to reprise my regulatory update, this time for regulatory activity in 2022. I want to extend my thanks to Alan and everyone at PubK Law for inviting me back again this year. I'm cognizant that I am the last speaker on the last day, and I am doing a regulatory update. I hope the content will be exciting enough to keep you both awake and engaged. Before I dive right in on these regulations, I wanted to identify a few themes that I observed from this year. Of course, as in years past, there is a catch-up between the NDAAs that Mike has discussed over the years and the regulatory implementation of those NDAAs by the FAR Council and DoD. And as we go through this, I will be talking about past NDAAs that are going into regulation. And in a couple of instances, there have been NDAA provisions passed in 2023 that might, if not undo those, significantly change those regulations that are just getting issued. There are also a sizable number of small business administration regulations and regulations conforming the FAR and other agency regulations to those Sba regulations that have already been issued. In the past, the FAR Council has committed to bridge that implementation gap, but a gap still tends to exist, unfortunately. Beyond catch-up, there are a few big idea regulations that stem from the Biden administration's implementation of its policy objectives. Another feature of this past year's regulations is that procurement policy is not linear. It is, in fact, a bit circular. So we'll see a little bit of deja vu all over again as tides in procurement preferences and policies for things like commercial products and services and fixed price contracting fall back into or out of favor. And finally, a number of agencies have taken the initiative to engage in regulatory housekeeping by updating and streamlining their agency-specific regulations. I'll try to touch on all of these regulations of general note that fall within these and other categories. So this first slide that you see here is the FAR Council's the start of the FAR Council's implementation of Sba Regs. The first bullet relates to a proposed rule issued by the FAR Council to update the FAR to make it consistent with Sba rules issued back in 2019, which clarified the point in the procurement process at which size status is determined for multiple award contracts. This proposed rule would amend FAR Part 19 to explain that for multiple award contracts that do not require offers to include a price, something that the FAR allows generally, Sba will determine size as of the date of the initial offer. There's also a provision in here regarding 8A participants with long-term contracts that are more than 5 years that requires contracting officers to verify an Sba's dynamic small business search system or the system for award management that the small business is still an Sba certified 8A participant no more than 120 days prior to the end of the 5th year of the contract. If the entity is not so certified, the CO is not supposed to exercise the option. The second bullet on this slide is a FAR Council final rule that amends the FAR to support Sba's policy of including overseas contract and agency small business contracting goals and allowing set-asides to apply to overseas procurement. So this will really assist agencies in meeting their small business goals. And in promulgating this final rule, there is also some flexibility put in there for the set-asides and whatnot, recognizing that overseas contracts might have other provisions that affect them, such as using host nation labor and whatnot. So a little bit of flexibility in there. Next slide, please. We have more small business from the FAR Council. The first bullet relates to a final rule to align the FAR with statutory and regulatory changes made by Sba in 2016 and in 2020 regarding joint ventures. This final rule provides criteria for a joint venture to qualify as a small business for set-aside contracts, including when the JV is comprised of a mentor and protege participating in Sba's mentor-protege program. The rule also requires agencies to consider the past performance of each party to a JV if the JV itself is unable to sufficiently demonstrate past performance on its own. For example, if the JV is very, very new. This change is intended to help new JVs, which can now rely on the past performance of their individual JV members. Excuse me. The second bullet relates to the FAR Council's final rule amending the FAR to incorporate changes to Sba's historically underutilized business zone or hub zone program. Now, this is a big deal because Sba issued rules in November of 2019 and I'll give you the Sba site because that's the, if you do hub zone work, you'll want, and you haven't looked at this, you really should. It's at 84 Fed Reg 65222. And this was a comprehensive revision to the hub zone program, the first in over 20 years. So you can see there were quite a lot of housekeeping and clarification and modifications of the regulations to implement and reflect current policies, eliminate ambiguities, and to reduce burdens on small businesses and procuring agencies in the hub zone space. So a pretty big change to the hub zone program. Among the many changes to the rules, and something that we're going to see throughout my discussion today about certification, hub zone entities are now certified by Sba, a change being made to many small business certifications. Go to the next slide. And this is an example of exactly that, a similar kind of change. I think I talked about the proposed rule last year. It's now a final rule. And it requires women-owned small businesses to be certified by SBA or an approved third-party certifier to be eligible for sole source or set-aside awards. Prior to the SBA rule changes and this FAR rule change, these businesses could self-certify themselves. One clarification that the final rule made to the proposed rules is that state governments are not an authorized certifying entity for these businesses. So we're going to leave small business for a little while on the next slide and start into the big ideas of the Biden administration. This is a relatively recent proposed rule from the FAR Council to implement the Biden administration's executive orders related to climate change and to add a requirement that certain contractors disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and climate-related financial risk and set science-based targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. This is a large, complex proposed rule, primarily because it draws on and refers to numerous external third-party standards and sources of information. It also follows on and draws on a proposed rule that is not entirely dissimilar that was issued by the Securities and Exchange Commission that would also require greenhouse gas emission disclosures. Before diving into an overview of this proposed rule, just address the elephant in the room that it's not unforeseeable that there will be legal challenges to the rulemaking itself, given the challenges that have been raised to similar executive orders that were based on the Procurement Act, such as the vaccination mandates. Given the litigation of those executive orders and the rules adopted under them, it's not inconceivable that parties will challenge these rules as not authorized by the Procurement Act and the president's authority thereunder. I don't weigh in on that one way or the other. I just know there's been a lot of litigation on EOs going into contracting in the past, and so we might see that going forward here. But putting all that aside, let's talk about the proposed rule. One thing is that it has a pretty low threshold for application. It covers significant contractors that have received between $7.5 and $50 million in federal contract obligations in the prior fiscal year. And then major contractors, these are terms defined in the statute, that receive more than $50 million in federal contract obligations in the prior fiscal year. Those are pretty low thresholds. I mean, $7.5 million is quite low. Significant contractors must disclose an inventory of their Scope 1 emissions, which are generally those from sources owned or controlled by the contractor, and their Scope 2 emissions, which are those from the generation of electricity, heating, cooling, or steam when purchased for that contractor's consumption, and those disclosures go in SAM. Major contractors would need to disclose not only Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but also Scope 3 emissions in SAM. And these include all other indirect emissions from the contractor's operations and can include things like vendor emissions, for example. They must post an annual climate disclosure on a public website and develop and post a science-based target validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative, this organization called SBTI, for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. The proposed rule provides limited exemptions for certain types of contractors, like Alaska Native corporations, and there is an exemption from the Scope 3 requirements for small business contractors. Under this proposed rule, there's a new responsibility determination baked in, and COs are to presume a covered contractor to be non-responsible if the contractor has not complied with its Part 23 obligations. These obligations would go into Part 23, unless the contracting officer determines that the non-compliance was outside the prospective contractor's control. The prospective contractor has provided documentation sufficient to demonstrate that it has taken steps towards compliance, and the contractor made a public commitment to comply no later than within 1 calendar year. So query how that's going to get implemented, because there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts there. Some of the concerns that I've heard expressed with this proposed rule, keeping my ear to the sidewalk, beyond the legal underpinnings for it, include that low threshold that I talked about. It seems to be based upon the threshold for application of the cost accounting standards, but the cost accounting standards within itself also includes a whole lot of exemptions. Another I guess concern is the potential scope of what is in a scope 3 emission. It could be really quite broad. The proposed rule does not have much, if any, discussion of how it would apply to subcontractors, and yet certainly major contractors might need information from their subcontractors. So that seems to be a pretty big gap. And then the use of these third-party international organizations and standards for compliance that frankly can be changed at any time. So this is just some. Moving on to the next slide. Still big ideas, but a little less big than the one I just talked about. The first bullet is the FAR Council's issuance of an interim rule to implement Executive Order 14026, which raised the hourly minimum wage paid by certain federal contractors to certain employees to $15 an hour. As noted on this slide, the Secretary of Labor can and has adjusted that threshold annually. This higher minimum wage requirement applies to contracts that are or were entered into after January 30th, 2022, or that were renewed or extended on or after January 30th, 2022, perhaps modifications and whatnot. There's a lower minimum wage that was under a prior executive order that applies to prior contracts. And the dueling minimum wages does set up a little bit of a compliance conundrum. The second bullet here is the FAR Council issued a final rule to issue the Biden administration's Executive Order 14005, ensuring the future is made in all of America by all of America's workers. This is essentially a doubling down on Buy American to increase the procurement preferences for domestically manufactured products and construction materials consisting of substantially all domestic content. The final rule amends the FAR to implement an increase in the domestic content threshold from 55% to 60%. That was effective October 25th, 2022. And then it goes up to 65% in 2024 and 75% in 2029. I will say that like Mike, I should have perhaps said this at the beginning, but I'll say it now. I have a longer write-up about all of these rules that will be posted on PubK's website. I've tried to include hyperlinks as well to these rulemakings. Hopefully they all work, knock on wood. So as I'm rushing through this and giving you just a thumbnail sketch, please note that I did give you more information in that written material. Can we go to the next slide, please? Going to turn to some kind of miscellaneous FAR rules. The first one in the first bullet is a final rule to implement Section 855 of the 2019 NDAA, which required that for construction contracts that are anticipated to be awarded to small businesses, agencies be a little bit more transparent and provide notice to prospective offerors regarding the agency's practices, policies, and compliance with requirements for timely definitization of requests for equitable adjustments resulting from change orders. The idea is to provide small businesses with more information in advance about how long it might take, for example, to have an REA addressed, if there's a construction change or delay, so that they can better prepare their proposals in advance, knowing, you know, what the stream of consideration might be, and also, of course, manage their finances during performance. The second bullet here is a final rule to implement Section 887 of the 2016 NDAA, so going way back in time, to revise FAR 1.102-2 to clarify that agency acquisition personnel are indeed permitted and encouraged to engage in exchanges with industry, so long as those exchanges do not promote an unfair competitive advantage. This concept of encouraging more communication between industry and government has been kicking around for years now. You might recall, if you've been around as long as I have, the Mythbuster memos that were issued by OFPP a few years ago, attempting to dispel this workplace misunderstandings about what communications are allowed. You know, my view is that this final rule, and there's all kinds of discussion in the final rule about it. It's actually, it's almost comical to me, because it's really pretty tame, and you might even say it's weak sauce in that it just encourages communication, but then it also says, oh, but be careful, don't have those communications lead into an unfair competitive advantage. So it's not like a whole ton of guidance for agencies. And my guess is that, you know, as a result, it might not have much of an effect. Those agencies and COs that are inclined to engage with industry and are more comfortable doing so will probably continue to, and those that are not, I'm not sure this is going to, you know, push them over the edge. Next slide, we're going to be moving into DoD regulations, and the first slide here relates to commercial item issues, although the term commercial item, although we still use it, is quickly coming out of fashion, because this DoD proposed rule is similar to previously issued FAR rules that will separately identify and define commercial products from commercial services in lieu of using the term from the past, commercial items. I think this is a good idea, a really good idea, in light of the fact that I think if any of you participated in the discussion of the claims cases, there was cases in which the concept of what is a commercial item was confusing because of the idea that services were involved. And so now separately saying, yea, verily, there are commercial products, and yea, verily, there are commercial services. Good idea. The second bullet there is one of those pendulum swings that I previously mentioned. This is to ease the requirements for commercial contracting. Every so often, there's a desire to tighten those up because there's a belief that people are abusing them. But now this is one to ease them up in response to NDAAs issued in 2017 and 2018, which provide that a contract for a product or service using FAR Part 12 procedures shall serve as a prior commercial item determination known as a CID, unless the head of the contracting activity determines in writing that the use of such procedures was improper then, or that it's no longer appropriate to require that product or service using commercial item procedures. This final rule will streamline FAR Part 12 and CID procedures and allow a CO to rely upon a prior commerciality determination or a prior contract or other evidence that an item has been previously procured by DoD using commercial FAR Part 12 acquisition procedures as the basis for a CID, instead of asking for the contractor to provide commerciality information anew to the contracting officer. So good news story there. Going on to the next slide. Another commercial issued, this time on IT, and this is another pendulum swing. In the past, there were some very unpopular attempts to limit the presumption that a commercial product or item was developed at private expense. The fiscal year 19 NDAA was a response to industry objection to those efforts, and also a concern that continuing with that type of questioning and pushing on whether or not something was developed at private expense might lead DoD to lose out on commercial products as companies decide, you know, I'm not going to give you that information. It's not worth it to me. So this rule is putting back in the general presumption of development at private expense. Next slide, please. These are cost or pricing related final rules. The first one, this is interesting because it harkens back to something that Mike mentioned just now in his presentation. This is a final rule that prohibits contracting officers from relying solely on historical prices paid by the government when determining whether a price of a contract or subcontract is fair and reasonable. It addresses a concern that Mike mentioned in his presentation. In particular, it requires DoD agencies to find offerors ineligible for award if they fail to make a good faith effort to comply with a reasonable request to submit data other than cost or pricing data. And as a result, the CO is unable to determine proposed prices are fair and reasonable by other means. Now, this final rule includes an exception that allows the head of a contracting activity to waive this finding if it's in the best interests of the government to award the contract, despite the lack of information. But it also incorporates sort of a shaming mechanism along the lines of sort of what Mike discussed, in that it amends the DFARS to instruct COs to add a notation in the contractor performance assessment reporting system, otherwise known as CPARS, which identifies contractors that have rejected multiple requests for submission of other than cost or pricing data over the last 3 years, and yet still received an award. So I guess this is sort of a sticky, carroty approach to making people provide that information, frankly, even if maybe they're not required to. The second bullet relates to is, I don't know, it's cost or pricing, but it sort of is. It's a final rule that essentially requires accounting firms that want to compete to perform auditing services for DoD to disclose if they have been disciplined in connection with their auditing service, and this will presumably assist agencies with evaluation and perhaps even responsibility determinations. Next slide. Hey, we're still in DoD. We have a couple compliance related slide rules on this slide and the next one. On the first bullet on this slide, this is a pretty straightforward implementation of a 2022 NDAA provision that requires a contractor to disclose the use of workers or facilities in China for the performance of a contract. Obviously, that is a national security concern that the government wants to know about. The second bullet is intended to fill a gap in the DFARS to ensure that lobbying restrictions on former DoD officials are reflected in the list of post-employment restrictions for DoD employees. And this is a gap that was identified in a relatively recent GAO report. The rule also updates DFARS 252.203-7005. There's the provision on these restrictions to clarify that former personnel are required to comply with all applicable post-government employment restrictions, not just those listed in the clause. And this is presumably intended to address a situation where the DFARS just can't keep up with new restrictions that might be imposed by Congress. The bottom line is that obviously, if you hire former government employees, particularly DoD employees, It's important that you understand the panoply of pre and post government restrictions that may apply to them based not only on what their prior position might have been, but also on their level of seniority. The next slide, please. This is another very straight implementation of an NDAA provision that prohibits confidentiality agreements that would prohibit or restrict employees from reporting fraud, waste, or abuse related to performance of a DoD contract. This type of restriction already exists in the FAR. So if you have any of these within your company, definitely good idea to ensure that they are appropriately limited and tailored, as these types of agreements are continually subject to scrutiny in light of numerous statutes and regulations that protect whistleblowers. Another, kind of related to these confidentiality agreements, you often see them partnering with a non-compete agreement. It's not in my presentation because it was issued by the FTC, but you all should note that the FTC is proposing a rule to prohibit non-compete agreements. So a lot of movement in this space. Next slide, please. The first bullet, another deja vu all over again issue. The government swings back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on its preference for fixed price contract and its disdain for cost reimbursable contracts. This has gone on for literally decades. And I even wrote a law review article about this, a long time ago. And even since then, this has still happened and nothing has changed. This final rule is yet another course correction that removes DFAR's language that implemented a prior NDAA, even before this last NDAA, that required COs to first consider a fixed price contract when determining contract type and required approval from the head of contracting activity for certain cost reimbursement contracts. So correcting for that disdain for cost reimbursable contracts a little bit. The second bullet relates to a proposed rule that is intended to instill better management of undefinitized contract actions, often referred to as UCAs, and to incentivize contractors to definitize those contracts more promptly at the risk of a withholding of payments of up to 5%. So if you are a contractor who often finds himself with UCAs, you will want to be tracking this rule because it will have some effect on getting things definitized more quickly. Next slide, please. We have some miscellaneous DoD rules. The first one is a proposed rule that would encourage acquisition personnel when acquiring non-commercial software. So not commercially available software, to do more than just consider the cost of that software, be it a license or acquisition cost, but to also factor in the life cycle costs of the software, which might, include something like fixes or modifications, as well as any other material or software that may be required to use that non-commercial software. This certainly all makes sense where the software appears to be perhaps uniquely created for a program or for the government. The second bullet implements another past NDAA related to other transaction agreements. And this final rule might find itself maybe not on the chopping block, but on the trimming block as a result of the 2023 NDAA that, as Mike related. This rule implemented a new DFARS provision 206.001-70 that provided that contracts for a follow-on production contract for products developed under OTA authority are exempt from competition requirements of FAR Part 6 if the solicitation and agreement included provisions for a follow-on contract and the CO receives sufficient documentation from the agreements officer that the statutory requirements for successful completion of that prototype project have been met. sounds like the 2023 NDAA is going to put some more flexibility in there. So, you know, this will be there for a little while until that gets done. Next slide. Okay, the first bullet here, this is the long-awaited DoD rule implementing the 2018 NDAA provision that provided for enhanced post-award debriefing rights for competitive negotiated DoD contracts, task orders, and delivery orders that exceed $10 million. For about 4 years, industry and agency DoD have been operating under a class deviation. And so now this replaces it. The final rule provides unsuccessful offerors with an opportunity to submit follow-on questions related to their debriefing within 2 business days. This is 2 business days is a difference from any other day calculations in the FAR. And for that debriefing to remain open until the offeror receives written responses to those enhanced debriefing questions from the agencies. Notably, the new DFARS provision 215.506-70C reflects developments by the Federal Circuit in the case Nika Technologies Inc. versus United States, decided in 2021, which considered when a debriefing closed under these enhanced debriefing procedures if no questions were in fact submitted. So this DFARS provision states that an offeror's debriefing is not concluded until the later of the date the debriefing was delivered, or if additional questions are timely received, i.e. within 2 business days of the debriefing, the date the agencies delivers its written responses. Stated differently, the rule provides that if no questions are submitted within that 2 business days, the debriefing closed on the date the debriefing was received by the offeror. So you don't get an extra 2 days. And the rule makes that clear. The second bullet is kind of a back in time implementation of the prior administration, not the Biden administration's by American order. And it by the FAR Council has already implemented this. DoD is now implementing this prior administration EO. Again, all of this is subject to a little bit of tweaking by the Biden administration's Buy American EO, which has slightly higher limits. But in implementing EO 1388-1, DoD, one thing it didn't do was utilize the percentage factor mandated by the EO to determine whether the offered price of material of domestic origin is unreasonably high or inconsistent with the public interest. The EO had factors of 20% or 30% for small businesses, 20% large, 30% small, but DoD uses a 50% factor, and so it retained that 50% factor. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another grab bag of miscellaneous provisions. I really only want to, excuse me, focus on the second and third bullets. The second bullet is a good news regulation that is intended to expedite contract closeouts. Instead of the threshold established in FAR Part 42 of $1 million or 10% of the contract's total value, DoD's proposed rules would create a threshold for quick closeout at $2 million of unsettled costs. And the proposed rule would also expand the authority of DCMA administrative contracting officers to negotiate settlements of direct and indirect costs prior to a determination of final direct costs and indirect rates. So this is part of a larger effort by DoD to better oversee and bring about contract closeout, a real headache for everybody, which was recommended by GAO in one of its past reports and by the Section 809 panel. Looking at the third bullet there, the December 19th rule, you would see that by its title, it relates to the Small Business Innovation research data rights and implements policies related to the Sbir program. And yes, it does have something to do with that, but the proposed rule actually goes a little bit farther and purports to amend standard DFARS data rights provisions in DFARS 252.227-7013, -7014 and -7018. Again, these are standard DFARS provisions to create an unlimited rights marking in favor of the government. So kind of, I don't want to say snuck in there, but kind of snuck in there. So as a result, if you deal with IP and data rights issues, regardless of whether you're a Sbir contractor, you might want to, take a gander at this proposed rule. As noted on the slide, this is pretty recent and comments are still open and will be accepted until mid-February. And DoD is also holding a virtual public meeting on February 2nd regarding this proposed rule, which is kind of intriguing, and I will be interested to hear if anybody raises any objection to the way the unlimited rights issue has been introduced. Okay, going to the next slide, we are going to leave DoD and enter the world of small business administration. In this first bullet, it's a final rule to implement provisions of the fiscal year 2021 NDAA, which changed the averaging period for SBA's employee-based size standard and average annual receipts from 12 to 24 months. This change affects businesses seeking to qualify as small under those employee-based and average annual receipts NAICS codes, such as those that often apply to manufactured products. I mentioned this in its proposed form last year as sort of a mixed bag. It benefits those small businesses that having a longer period when they had a small amount of employees in their early days and have more employees now by allowing them to stay small longer. But it's not so great for small businesses that were large and have contracted and will still have their larger employee base considered. But it is what it is. The second bullet is consistent with what I mentioned before about SBA moving to consolidate status certifications. This final rule implements a requirement to transfer the certification of veteran-owned small businesses and service-disabled small business concerns that participate in the veteran certification program from the Department of Veteran Affairs to the SBA. Next slide, please. Okay, this is I'm not going to talk about these individually on my slides here and in the written materials that I provided as a supplement. You can find the details on the addition of various NAICS codes and the various adjustments made to size standards. A lot of these are made as sort of a catch-up for the passage of time and inflationary increases, and there are quite a number of these. So, I commend this to your further reading, particularly if you are, doing a lot of work with small businesses. Let's go to the next slide, please. These are some miscellaneous small business administration rules. The first bullet is a good news story for small businesses and a subcontract management issue to put on your radar if you are a large business. This SBA final rule provides two new methods for small businesses to obtain qualifying past performance ratings. That something that has been an impediment to small businesses competing in the past. First, a small business can use past performance of a joint venture of which it is a member, so long as the small business worked on this joint venture's contract or contracts. Second, the small business may use past performance obtained as a first-tier subcontractor on a prime contract that had a subcontracting plan. The fiscal year 2021 NDAA authorized a small business to seek a past performance rating from its prime contractor, and the final rule would require that prime contractor to provide that rating within 15 days of the request. So ding, ding, ding for large business subcontract management. You'll have to provide those evaluations. Also, this new requirement must be incorporated in large prime contractor small business subcontracting plans. Next slide. We're going to move from Small Business Administration to the Department of Labor. Obviously, not just the FAR Council and DoD affect contractors, all these other agencies do so as well. This first bullet is perhaps not the most exciting new rule, but it's one to watch if you work in the Davis-Bacon Act, aka construction space. This is a proposed rule to completely overhaul the regulations related to the Davis-Bacon Act and the numerous Davis-Bacon Act related statutes. This is the first significant regulatory revision in 40 years. So you can expect a lot of updates. It's a pretty lengthy rule. Among the numerous updates, the DOL intends to increase the information available for wage determinations, create new methodologies to improve the currentness and accuracy of those determinations, and address enforcement issues related to omission of Davis-Bacon and related Act contract clauses. The second proposed rule relates to a Biden administration reinstatement of an Obama-era policy on the non-displacement of Service Contract Act workers when there is a recompetition of the Service Contract Act and it flips to a new contractor. The clause would require that the new contractor and its subcontractor offer qualified incumbent employees under the predecessor contract a right of first refusal of employment under the successor contract. One noteworthy difference from prior non-displacement rules is the removal of a same location requirement, which means that the non-displacement rule, if adopted as proposed, would apply to Service Contracts Act even if performance is relocated to a new physical location. Another noteworthy aspect is it gives the employee 10 business days to consider the rule, and it makes a little bit more stringent the standards when a contractor need not retain an employee because they believe just cause exists to discharge them. So a slightly stricter standard would apply under this proposed rule. Next slide, please. This is a really interesting, as far as Department of Labor rules can fall into that category, proposed rule from the OFCCP arm of DOL. So in late 2020, OFCCP published and issued final rules regarding how it would handle allegations and review of allegations of employment discrimination through the use of predetermination notices and notices of violation. It's now issuing a whole new proposed rule. The proposed rule retains the use of predetermination notices and notices of violation from the 2020 rules, but proposes to substantially modify, some would say undo, the evidentiary requirements and procedures from those rules. For example, the 2020 regulations clarified the standards for issuing a predetermination notice and said that they're the same for issuing a notice of violation. The rules also required that the notice of violation specifically address the defenses and counter evidence that a contractor presented in response to a predetermination notice. The 2020 rules also had pretty rigorous standards of proof for OFCCP to pursue a violation of disparate treatment. There had to be, with 3 narrow exceptions, there had to be mathematical or statistical evidence and other documentary or testimonial qualitative evidence to support a finding of disparate treatment. And these regulations generally required OFCCP to demonstrate practical significance to support a finding of discrimination, meaning that even if there were disparities that were statistically significant, they also had to be material to warrant enforcement. This proposed rule would rescind virtually all of that, which OFCCP now describes as overly rigid standards, including the dual requirement for these qualitative and quantitative standards, and as well as this practical significance requirement. OFCCP now says that these standards were more rigorous than the law arguably required, and it suggests that these rules impaired its enforcement abilities because OFCCP has been spending resources addressing challenges from contractors regarding whether they complied with their rules rather than resolving audits. This rule also severely shrinks the amount of time to respond to a predetermination notice from 30 to 50 days. So, see what the change in an administration can do. This is a complete change up. Next slide. Okay, these are two rules that I talked about last year relating to GSA. They're now in their final form. The first bullet is a cleanup of GSA's FAR supplement with respect to IT procurements and cybersecurity. I commend this to your review because GSA is obviously a big purchaser of IT products. The second bullet relates to finalization of a GSA rule regarding extension of federal supply schedule contracts. This rule reflects a fairly long-standing policy that GSA had followed that allowed for extensions of these contracts. GSA decided to make it a bit more formal and a bit more transparent by including it in the GSAR. So now there is an actual clause, option to extend the term of FSS contracts, a GSAR clause, which would allow the government to extend the term of an FSS contract for an additional 5-year period up to 3 times. Moving to the next slide, please. Mike previewed this slide in his discussion of the Cyber Reporting and Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. Here, what I've noted is that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, called CISA, is starting that regulatory process to develop regulations about cyber incident reporting and ransom payments by issuing a request for information that it will presumably use to develop its regulations, and it's seeking input on terms and definitions and all kinds of other issues that hopefully they will factor in when coming to their final rules, or proposed rules rather. Next slide, please. Just wanted to point out, this deals with the Federal Highway Administration, also not a particularly sexy rule, but perhaps a little known fact that IDIQ contracts were authorized for state departments of transportation that use Federal Highway Administration funding only under a particular experimental project number. And now this final rule allows those state departments of transportation to use such contracts on a more permanent basis. So good news for state DOTs. Next slide. Okay, I am going to close out just by pointing to on these slides agency updates to the regulations. On this first slide here, we see that the Department of Agriculture, a somewhat sleepy little agency, is updating its regulations for the first time since 1996. And the Department of Transportation is updating its regulations for the first time since its last revision in 2005. As part of DOT's efforts, which we see in other agency updates, is a lot of moving of internal processes and guidance from the regulations and putting them in separate acquisition manuals. DOT's regulations are also implementing some information security requirements, which is a pretty darn good idea for transportation systems. And presumably those have evolved a lot since 2005. The next slide is kind of more of the same, but focused on the VA. I mentioned in the past that VA has been going through a phased approach to updating the VA acquisition regulation supplement. And these two final rules are part of that effort. Like the DOT and other agency, VA is moving a lot of that to moving a lot of its internal guidance out of the regulations and into acquisition manuals. And so, the bottom line story from all of this is, agencies are going through these efforts, and there's a reasonable amount of agency specific attention to their FAR supplements. So it's a good reminder that in addition to checking the FAR, you should scan the agency supplements to understand if there are any agency specific clauses or requirements or changes that might have been snuck into them. And so I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll turn it back to Alan.
Well, Cara, Michael, thank you very, very much. Michael, I'll try to get Congress to enact the legislation a little sooner in the year so that you don't have to engage
Exactly.
during the December and January timeframe on this omnibus legislation. Kudos again to you and Cara for the amount of preparation and content here. It's understandable why this is always such a highly attended and well-acclaimed panel. So a big thank you to both of you for your participation. Let me again thank our event sponsors for their support for this entire program. The names are on these next two slides. We couldn't have done this program without them. As soon as the registration material is available, we'll provide all registrants with information on how to access it. If you need CLE credit, we are applying for approval in 7 states. Let Craig LaChance know if you have any questions. If you're not a subscriber to the PubK family of newsletters, I hope you'll consider doing so. Information is on the PubK website, pubkgroup.com, and just click on subscriptions. You'll find it there. It's hard to believe, but this concludes PubK's 2023 annual review. I wish you all success in the marketplace and look forward to seeing you at future PubK events. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the day.